Good day. This is Rhonda reading from the book The Lost Gospel, the Book of Q and Christian Origin, Part 4, 1, Chapter 1, Part 4, Galilee before the War. In the world of Christian imagination, Galilee belonged to Palestine. The religion of Palestine was Judaism, so everyone in Galilee must have been Jewish. Since this picture is wrong, and since Q can make no sense as long as it prevails, the reader needs to have a truer picture in mind. This chapter presents a sketch of what scholars are discovering about Galilee as a discrete social and cultural location, and about the situation that prevailed in the first century CE. It is the historical once upon a time that sets the stage for the story of Q. A glance at the following map will show that Galilee was not contiguous to Judea. It was even further removed from Jerusalem than Samaria, the home of age-old religious traditions that had always been in competition with loyalty centered in Jerusalem. During the 3 or 4 centuries prior to the time of Jesus, tensions had escalated between the Samaritans, who were resident in the land when the Jews returned from exile in Babylon in 539 BCE, and the Jewish leaders who determined to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. Sometime during the 4th century, a parting of the ways took place when, as the stories recall, the Samaritan king Sanballat wanted to join with the Jews and help construct a team at Jerusalem, but was rebuffed. Later in the mid-2nd century BCE, the Jews won their independence from the Seleucids of Antioch, the successors in the religion, the legacy of Alexander the Great, and established the Maccabean Hasmonean dynasty of priest kings in Jerusalem. They then set out on a program to conquest and annexation to regain control of all the territory associated with the golden age of David and Solomon. The Samaritans to the north were conquered and their temple destroyed in 135 BCE. The Idumeans, I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that right, to the south of Judea were just conquered and forced to be circumcised, a rather irrevocable mark to a very revocable allegiance. And Galilee was not annexed until about 100 BCE. The reports of these wars show that there was strong popular resistance against Jewish domination. The fighting was fierce. The conquered peoples did not regard their annexation as a homecoming, and loyalty to Jerusalem could not be taken for granted. As for Galilee, it had never been fully incorporated into the cultural entity that Christians imagined as Israel. It was a land of mixed peoples, a crossroads, and a kind of buffer zone on the borders of petty kingdoms that had had their centers to the north in Syria, to the east in Transjordan and Damascus, and to the south in Samaria and Jerusalem. For centuries, these petty kingdoms had been pawns in the large-scale contests that centered even farther away in empires of the upper Tigris Euphrates to the north and Egypt to the south. From the perspective of those who sat in power in Egypt and Babylon, excuse me, the petty kings in Antioch, Damascus, the Philistine Plain, and Jerusalem were worth having on one side, but Galilee was hardly worthy of a moment's consideration. It had no capital city, no king, no temple, and no hierarchy of priests. In the constant shifts in political power, with armies marching up and down the highways of the Levant, Galilee was a no man's land reserved for initial skirmishes in larger undertakings. It was a kind of beachhead where the surge of political cross-currents constantly kept the people on their toes. It is not surprising that loyalty to kings and their gods was not a Galilean virtue. Even the old stories of Israel's conquest of the land told of the failure to take completely the regions of Galilee from those who already lived there, peoples who refused to join in the tribal confederations. We tend to think of Galilee as a natural part of the land of Israel because the kingdoms of David and Solomon included it, and because the extent of their kingdoms became the ideal realm for any Jewish state centered in Jerusalem. But Galilee belonged to the kingdom of David and Solomon for less than 100 years. After that, it was part of the kingdom of Israel with its own northern traditions and its capital at Shechem. The provincial center, later to be known as Samaria, then it was annexed as a province by Assyria, transferred to Neo-Babylonia, and invaded by the Persians. The stories of the Jews who returned from the deportation to Babylon belong to the history of Jerusalem and Judea, not to Samaria and the district of Galilee. The stories say that the Jews found the Samaritans unworthy to help build the Temple of Jerusalem because they had intermarried with the people of other cultures. And as for Galilee, it was known among Jews as the land of the Gentiles. After Alexander, the Hellenizing programs of the Ptolemies and Seleucids dotted the landscape on all sides of Galilee with newly founded cities on the Greek model. Greek cities were founded in Phoenicia, southern Syria, the Decapolis region of 10 cities to the east of the Sea of Galilee, northern Palestine, and the coastlands to the west. Theaters, schools, stadia, porticoed markets, administrative offices, foreign legions, and transplanted people with franchise as citizens took their place as signs of the Hellenistic age. Samaritans and Galileans did not resist. They did not generate a revolution like that of the Maccabees in Judea. Jewish resistance to Hellenistic forms of governance and culture was centered in Judea. The Maccabees resisted in the interest of conserving a specific image of Jewish culture based on the ancient Near Eastern model of the temple state. The temple state was ruled by a king who was invested with executive power and a high priest who represented purity, or the culture's codes of propriety. In the eyes of the Maccabees, the leaders of the Jerusalem establishment were in danger of accommodating Greek culture and turning Jerusalem into a Hellenistic city. The situation came to a head in 167 BCE when the infamous Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes put Syrian troops in Jerusalem to suppress resistance to this Hellenizing program. The Maccabee brothers started a guerrilla campaign against two fronts: Syrian hegemony, in parentheses, the wrong kings, and the Jerusalem aristocracy, in parentheses, the wrong high priests. They fought under the banner of the quote-unquote traditions of the fathers, and were eventually successful against the Syrian armies and the Jerusalem establishment. They were less successful in the Battle of Cultures. After winning independence for Jerusalem, the Maccabees as assumed for themselves the roles both of king and high priest and established the Hasmonean dynasty, 140 BCE. They took their military victories as a sign that the time had come to restore the kingdom of David and Solomon. That, however, was not an easy thing to do, even for kings prepared to use armies on the model of the Hellenistic tyrants. Their project of expansion required an additional 40 years of military activity, with Galilee the last to be annexed in 100 BCE. Thus, their rule over the land of Israel lasted only from 100 to 63 BCE, when a second momentous political complication set the stage for the final chapter of what we now call the Second Temple State. In 63 BCE, Pompey entered the picture to settle an internecine conflict for the Hasmonean throne and turned Palestine into a Roman province. This meant yet another superimposition of military, political, economic, social, and cultural presence with which Galileans had to contend. With such a history, it may come to a surprise to learn that Galilee supported a vibrant and productive society. It was a land of rolling hills and fertile valleys, bordered to the north and west by mountainous terrain, to the east by the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River, and to the south by the mountains of Samaria. Thus, it was somewhat protected from the brunt of armies that preferred, if possible, to use the major north-south routes, one of the east called King's Highway, or the major road along the seacoast to the west. Of course, armies always needed food, and Galilee was known as a little breadbasket. But for the Galileans, there were always the mountains to the north for hiding, should there be a need to escape from the military forays with designs upon them or their produce. In the case of traders, however, the traffic was constant. There were roadways through Galilee that gave access in all directions to the wider world of travel and trade, to Damascus, Tyre, Ptolemais, Caesarea, Samaria, Jerusalem, the Transjordan, and the Decapolis. These roads linked up with the major routes mentioned above that connected the Levant with Egypt, Syria, and the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. They also provided access to active seaports on the Mediterranean. Thus, Galilee was fully exposed to the ebb and flow of goods, ideas, and reports of events that generated social and cultural change in the Greco-Roman age. Galilee was known for its sunny and temperate climate and its land watered by springs. The shores of the Sea of Galilee were something of a resort, and the lake sustained important fisheries. Galilee was famous for its grains, olive oil, wines, fruits, nuts, dates, and fish, all of which were produced in sufficient quantity to export. The land was thickly populated with peasants, small farmers, hand workers, and day laborers living in small villages and medium-sized towns. There's archaeological evidence that the villages and towns of Galilee formed networks of exchange for a diversified market of foods, goods, and craftwork. The picture one gets is that Galilee, with its self-supporting economy, was a good place to live. If only the kings and their armies did not sweep through too often. Who then were these people? In the ancient Near East and the lands along the eastern Mediterranean Sea, social identity was marked by the land, culture, and people to which one belonged. One spoke of tribes, peoples, and nations, and for each there was a distinct location that centered the shrines and symbols of one's cultural tradition. When meeting a stranger, the first disclosure of importance would be one's ethnic identity. The Greek term was ethnos, meaning race, nation, people, tribe, etc. Thus, it made some difference whether one was Egyptian or Syrian, Cyprian, Hellene, Roman, and so forth. In Palestine, distinctions of importance were made, for instance, among Jews from Judea, the land of Judah, with its temple in Jerusalem, Idumeans, Samaritans, Phoenicians, and Syrians, each with their acknowledged lands and cities. But who was a Galilean? The name Galil, Gelil, meant district, and so referred to a geographical region rather than a land associated with a particular ethnic extraction or culture. Galil Hagoyim, that's second word is Hagoyim, was the district of the nations, the part of the mythic land of Israel that Jews and Samaritans shared with other peoples. Judging from its history and with an eye on a good historical atlas, the changing borders of lands contiguous to Galilee indicate it had been open to a variety of Semitic peoples from the lower Levant, including those from coastal districts, the valleys of the upper Jordan drainage, and the Bedouin lands stretching to the east. Archaeological evidence shows an ebb and flow of population. So it must have been a land where peoples and their cultures frequently met and mixed. The long history of conquests by ancient Near Eastern empires also must have contributed to the mix of peoples and cultures in Galilee. And the foundation of cities during the Hellenistic period populated the Levant with colonists from afar. Since Galilee was not known as a land of origin for specific ethnic identity or the cultivation of hoary traditions, or its cultural production of literature and institutions of religion, some scholars have concluded that it was largely rural in mentality and peasant in population, a sort of illiterate, sleepy backwater isolated from the political and ideological currents that determined loyalties in the bouncy history of Palestine and the Levant. But such an assessment does not match the picture that is now coming into view. One has to account for the savvy and self-confidence of a mixed people who managed to create a landed way of life and sustain it in the face of repeated subjections to foreign rulers eager for the control and taxation of its production. It is true that no Galilean city ever played a role comparable to centers of regional loyalties, petty kingdoms, and commercial enterprise, such as Samaria, Tyre, or Damascus. Sepphoris, one of Galilee's larger towns, and the seat of governance under the Hasmoneans and Herodians, is not even mentioned in the histories of Israel. And there is no history of loyalty to any god of royalty, nor had Galilee a history of wars to cleanse the land of unclean people or power. But that does not mean that Galileans did not love their land, had no shrines, and did not know how to celebrate life together. It does not mean that their towns and villages did not function, or that the people were not wide awake and fully apprised of the wider world around them. 300 years of Hellenistic influence just before the time of Jesus is an especially important factor. Hellenistic influence has been downplayed by scholars in the interest of buttressing the picture of Jesus appearing in the midst of a thoroughly Jewish culture. Unfortunately for this view, archaeological evidence of the Hellenization in Galilee continues to increase. Since language is such a basic index of cultural influence, it is significant that southern Galilee was largely Greek-speaking in the first century, though of course bilingual. Although the Ptolemies and Seleucids had not colonized Galilee by founding a new city in the middle of the region, Galilee was surrounded by cities on the Hellenistic model. The towns of the Decapolis were newly founded Hellenistic cities. One of them, Scythopolis, was on the southern border of Galilee, and another, Gadara, was just across the Jordan, a day's walk from Nazareth or Sepphoris. All of these cities were proud of their Hellenistic institutions, including theaters, sporting arenas, quote in parentheses, gymnasia, and schools. Gadara produced famous philosophers and poets of the Cynic school, including Meleager, 100 BCE, Philodemus, 110 to 40 BCE, and Oenomaus, 120 CE. Tiberias, built by Herod Antipas on the shore of the Sea of Galilee in 19 CE, was founded on the Hellenistic model. And Sepphoris, an hour's walk from Nazareth, was a thoroughly Hellenized city. It was rebuilt by Herod Antipas during Jesus' time, and archaeological investigations have unearthed a theater and the now famous mosaic of Dionysus. The dates for these important pieces of evidence are unfortunately still disputed, ranging from the 1st to the 2nd century CE, but even if they belong to the 2nd century, they should not be discounted, for they demonstrate the extent to which Hellenistic culture was taken for granted in Galilee, despite an increasing influx of Jews in the period after the Roman-Jewish War of 66 to 73 CE. What then can be said about a Jewish presence in Galilee before the war? Jews may have moved into Galilee at any time after the exile, and especially during the Hellenistic age, as part of the movement of peoples characteristic of the times. If so, a rather strange circumstance must be imagined for Jews living in Galilee. Normally, Jews in the diaspora, spelling diaspora, meaning living outside of Judea, formed communities of mutual support. In Egypt, for instance, they built quote-unquote houses of prayer, where they met to cultivate their Jewish culture at a distance from their temple and land. But would Jews in Galilee have formed diaspora congregations or built buildings for that purpose? The customary answer has been yes, and in the course of the 1st century, the term synagogue does mean to appear as a name for Jewish congregation, both in Palestine and throughout the Roman Empire. But the Greek word synagogue simply means congregation, and so must have referred at first to the people coming together. not to the place or building where they gathered. In the Levant, at any rate, congregation had been taken place for millennia at shrines, city gates, and city squares. It was during Roman times that the term synagogue became attached to the place or building in which meeting occurred, and a Jewish synagogue or building was a standard feature in cities throughout the empire. The problem is that according to archaeological evidence, synagogue buildings in Galilee appear only in the 3rd century CE. This documents the influx of Jews after the war, but says nothing about the situation before the war. Before the war, Josephus tells of synagogue in Caesarea, Caesarea, Dora, and Tiberias. So there were synagogues in cities adjacent to Galilee on the diaspora model, and Herod's Tiberias may have had one also on the diaspora model. But before the Roman period, it seems highly unlikely that Jews moving to Galilee would have considered themselves living in the diaspora or have formed congregations on its model. That is because there was another model for Jewish congregation indigenous to Judea and by extension to northern Israel. Whereas the diaspora model was a form of local and independent Jewish congregation, the Ma'amadoth, or priestly scribal stations in the village square, were official outposts of the temple system of governance and taxation, situated in villages central to a region. They served as courts and housed scribes who oversaw the life and production of the people. They also provided a place where calls to prayer were coordinated with the temple services in Jerusalem. After the annexation of Galilee in 100 BCE, it is possible that a similar system was introduced into the new territory. Certainly, there were official scribes in Galilee during the period of governance from Jerusalem, and Jews who had taken up residence there may have gained some prominence and control of some local Galilean town courts or congregations of elders, the form of governance typical for villages and towns in antiquity. So Jewish presence in Galilee after 100 BCE was no doubt obvious and may have set a new cultural tone. At the very least, all Galileans were now required to acknowledge Jerusalem as the royal city in charge of Galilean affairs instead of Antioch. Galileans must have paid their temple taxes. Josephus reports that they took advantage of the thrice yearly pilgrimage requirements to Jerusalem in order to seek a hearing for their grievances. And Jews in Galilee must have paid some attention to the laws and codes related to Jewish identity and practice. But it would be wrong to picture Galilee as a suddenly converted to a Jewish loyalty and culture. Even if one were to imagine that local lore had kept alive memories of belonging to the old kingdom of Israel, the distinctions among Galileans, Samaritans, and Jews have to be kept in mind. The Samaritans had certainly kept alive the old traditions of quote unquote northern Israel, focused on Shechem, Samaria, but they were not for that reason Jews. And Galilee was not Samaria, just as Samaria was not Judea. So even the Semitic component of the Galilean population needs to be carefully nuanced, lest the fact of Jewish presence in Galilee allow the myth of a common Jewish culture to continue. And the Pharisees, ah, yes, the Pharisees. Even conservative Christian scholars have begrudgingly had to admit that there is only the spottiest evidence for the presence of Pharisees in Galilee before the Roman Jewish War, and nothing to suggest they had any position of power there. The Pharisees were active in Jerusalem and represented a form of Jewish thought and piety that took on increased importance in the course of the first century. But scholars have not been able to identify any official function for them, whether within Galilee or at Jerusalem. Views of them have ranged from political party, scribal retainers of the temple bureaucracy, teachers in schools, such as those of Hillel or Shammai, to members of a religious society or sect. No theory seems to satisfy. Jacob Neusser, 1973, is probably right that it is best to see them as individuals who espoused and practiced a simple code of purity rules as the mark of a Jewish way of life. They developed this code in the midst of a confusion of cultures and at a time when it was clear that the Jewish temple state was coming to its end. For the study of the Jesus movement, and especially for an understanding of the charges leveled against the Pharisees in Q, it is extremely important to know that the Pharisees were not officials in charge of Jewish synagogues. That is the picture Christians have had in mind, and there is absolutely no basis for it whatsoever. And the Romans? Tension did mount under the Romans. Their attempt to resolve the conflict between Asmonean rivals for the priest kingship of Jerusalem and its domain, which now stretched from Idumea to Galilee, only unleashed a sorry history of atrocities that lasted from 63 to 37 BCE. The rivals, Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II, formed factions, and a leading Idumean family of strong men, the Herodians, played the middle as generals in the army. Finally exasperated, the Romans appointed Herod the Great to be king over Palestine, leaving the selection of high priests to the Jews. Herod ruled from 37 to 4 BCE. He succeeded in establishing the Pax Romana in Palestine, but his rule was harsh and unpopular, and it set the stage for a bit of unrest around the time of Jesus. Excuse me. Incidents at Sepphoris can be used to illustrate the nature of the violence and unrest that played itself out in Galilean soil during this period. In 55 BCE, Herod was a general in Galilee serving under his father, Antipater. I hope I said that. Antipater, who had just been named procurator of Palestine. Herod and his father had taken sides with Hyrcanus II, and the Romans had blessed this union by recognizing Hyrcanus as high priest while shifting executive and military power to Antipater as their appointee. While in Galilee, Herod set out to track down and kill a certain Hezekiah, the leader of a band of robbers operating on the Syrian border. He did this apparently to ingratiate himself with the Roman legate in Syria, Sextus Caesar. And for a time, the Herods seemed to have all under control. However, their fortunes turned in 40 BCE when the surviving son of Aristobulus II, and I apologize for any mispronunciations, took control of Jerusalem with the help of Parthian troops. Basil, Herod's brother, committed suicide in Galilee, and Herod himself fled to Rome. There the Romans appointed him king and sent him back to Galilee to restore order. Upon return, Herod's first move was to occupy Sepphoris and turn it into a military base from which to march on Jerusalem. Josephus reports that the people of Sepphoris fled the city as Herod approached. Then, after Herod's death in 4 BCE, Judas the Galilean, son of the slain Hezekiah, stormed the military installation at Sepphoris to get at the armory. The Roman legate from Antioch responded by burning Sepphoris to the ground and, according to Josephus, sold the people into slavery. In accordance with Herod's desire, Augustus had divided Palestine into 3 districts, one for each of his sons, with Archelaus as ethnarch of Judea and Samaria, Philip as tetrarch of northern Transjordan, and Herod Antipas as tetrarch of Galilee and Perea, or southern Transjordan. Archelaus was no match for the assignment, and from 6 CE until the Roman-Jewish War, Judea Samaria was ruled by Roman procurators, governors in charge of procuring tribute. But Herod Antipas and Philip enjoyed relatively long and quiet reigns. Herod ruling Galilee from 4 BCE to 39 CE. During his rule, Herod Antipas first rebuilt Sepphoris, presumably on the Hellenistic model, and then founded Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, certainly on the Greek model. Sepphoris was again caught in the middle of international intrigue during the prelude to the Roman-Jewish War. The political and social situation in Jerusalem had deteriorated to the level of riots, plundering, and factions engaged in guerrilla warfare for control of the temple precincts. Vespasian, the Roman general, was appointed legate in Palestine to quell the unrest, and Josephus was sent from Jerusalem to raise an army at Sepphoris as a defense against Vespasian's forces. Josephus found that the Galileans refused to get involved, and he was unsuccessful in his attempt to raise an army for the defense of Jerusalem. Later, when writing the history of war as a leading Jewish intellectual who now wished to mollify Roman attitudes towards the Jews, Josephus explained the Galileans were too peaceful, quote unquote, peaceful. The modern historian detects a Galilean disaffection with the warring kings in the troubled times. Galileans had no reason to be loyal either to the Romans or to the Herodians or to the temple establishment in Jerusalem. If that is so, We need to find reasons for the attraction of the Jesus movement other than those that Christians have traditionally had in mind. In the Christian imagination, Jesus appeared on a thoroughly Jewish scene that was ripe for religious reform. New Testament scholars have therefore looked for circumstances in Galilee that would explain the popular reception of Jesus' message and the rapid expansion of the Jesus movements. Every proposal must combine an interpretation of Jesus' message with a picture of popular mentality in order to account for the attractiveness and motivation of the movement. There are four major types of explanation. 1. Reformation. 2. Revolution. 3. Sectarian formation. And 4. Utopian program. None of them fits Q, and none fits the circumstances in Galilee. The theory of Reformation the theory of Reformation arises from the history of Christian theology. According to this view, Judaism was badly in need of reform because the temple state was based on a priestly system of sacrificial religion that was primitive, embarrassing, and wrong. Or focusing upon the Pharisees, the religion of Judaism has been characterized as exclusivistic, legalistic, and wrong. Or reading the Hebrew scriptures as the Old Testament of the Christian Bible, the Jews had not listened to the prophets, were a disobedient people, and were greatly in need of the Messiah, lest they fall under the wrath of their righteous God. But neither righteous indignation, nor Pharisaic burden, nor revulsion at the thought of a sacrificial cult are appropriate descriptions of a Galilean mentality to which Jesus may have appealed. And there is nothing in Q to support a message directed to any of these concerns. The theory of a revolution is a 20th century notion. It assumes that Jesus' conflict with the Jerusalem establishment was generated by a messianic mission and interprets the Gospels in the light of Josephus' accounts to the Jewish factions that fought for control of the temple in the Roman Jewish War. Most explanations of this scenario ride on the caveat that, of course, Jesus's revolution, quote unquote, was different because it was nonviolent and aimed at spiritual reform. But this theory doesn't work. Mark's gospel was written in the 70s, and his account of Jesus in Jerusalem is anachronistic, for he plays on the recent memories of the war to gain plausibility for his story. And the revolts from 66 to 73 CE, reported by Josephus, can hardly be used as examples of any earlier incidents of popular protest or of aristocratic intrigue with designs upon control of the temple system. The theory is especially flawed, however, because of its faulty assumption that a call for revolt against the Romans and or temple establishment in Jerusalem would have motivated Galileans to rally around Jesus. There is nothing in Q to suggest anything of the kind. The theory of sectarian formation is rooted in a long history of the Christian claim to be the new or true Israel, quote unquote, or people of God. According to this theory, the early church emerged from within Judaism as the fulfillment of Israel's promise, as its righteous remnant, or as those who faithfully recognized Jesus as the Messiah. Its 20th century version is couched in the apocalyptic hypothesis, according to which the Jews were undone by signs of divine displeasure and impending judgment. All were both fearful and expectant before the coming of the Messiah. Voila, voila. Jesus appeared, and those who recognized him naturally constituted the remnant of the worthy. The problem with this scenario is that neither apocalyptic hysteria nor the sense of being a righteous remnant is a plausible motivation for generating a movement in Galilee. An apocalyptic message only works as a motivation to form a sect from within the world of Jewish religious identity to which one already belongs. There is no hint of the formation of a Jewish sect in Q1. And even in Q2, where apocalyptic idiom occurs, the primary loyalty is to a Jesus movement based on some other attraction. The theory of a utopian program is a recent scholarly proposal. The notion is that the situation in Galilee had become desperate for the peasants. Persistent poverty, plundering, and a system of double taxation to Rome as well as to the Jerusalem temple had rendered many homeless and reduced the people to starving. Jesus appeared with a vision of the kingdom of God. He talked about the evil riches. He talked about the evil of riches. He said that God would provide food and clothing. He performed healings and the crowds gathered around. Unfortunately for this theory, archaeological studies of Galilee and the economic history of the Levant do not support such a picture. The notion of double taxation assumes that Roman tribute was superimposed on an already heavy tax levied by the temple state. It is, of course, true that heavy taxation of produce and the payment of tribute were standard features of the aristocratic empires in antiquity. It is also true that Roman governance was mainly a matter of securing order and taking tribute. But the Roman practice in general was to use the local system of levies, not to create new ones. Excuse me. And to take their bite off the top as a kind of taxation. So whether there was a system of double taxation under Herod is quite unclear. It is even less clear what happened to the temple tax system in Galilee under Herod Antipas, who had no official connection with the temple establishment in Jerusalem. In the face of such uncertainties and lacking evidence for destitute conditions in Galilee, it is best not to assume that Jesus' main attraction was the announcement of a utopian ideal. What then if the Jesus movement was not generated by a passion to reform Judaism or by a revolt against foreign powers or by an economic revolution? What was its attraction? Something other than charismatic display, ecstatic religious experience, or a message of eternal salvation must have generated the movement, because there is nothing in the text of Q that reflects interest of this kind. So what may its attraction have been? Two lines of investigation are still open. One is that clues about the motivation of the people of Q may surely be found in the text of Q if we give it a fresh, close reading. The other is that a clearer picture of the social circumstances in Galilee may provide a setting that can help explain such motivations. As the story of Q unfolds, it will become clear that two features of its sociology are inextricably intertwined. One is a rather strong challenge to the individuals to dare a natural and simple lifestyle. The other is a seriousness that developed about loyalty to a group. The question then is whether such a group, based on such an unconventional call to individual freedom, could have been its own attraction. The answer seems to be yes, but in order to see why this was, so we need to enlarge the picture of life in Galilee to include a number of cultural considerations. The consequence, the conquests, I'm having trouble reading today. Sorry about that, folks. The conquests of Alexander and the subsequent spread of Hellenic culture have been idealized and romanticized in Western thought, as had the Pax Romana. But the cultural contributions of the Greeks and the social orders achieved by the Romans were not unmixed blessings. That is because the Greco Roman age also brought to an end the civilizations of the ancient Near East that had been in place for 3 millennia or more. The social system basic to these cultures was that we now call the temple state a model that had been honed to perfection and replicated over and over again, whether in a more stable elaboration such as Egypt enjoyed, or as the more vulnerable Near Eastern kingdom. The temple state center defined and maintained the society's myths, rituals, codes of recognition, patterns of thought and behavior, social hierarchies, national boundaries, system of education, ground of festivals, social ethics, laws, and the meaning of a people's labor, production, and exchange. In wake of Alexander, temple states crumbled and the social structure supporting these cultures was destroyed. As for the Greek city-state, highly touted as the better way, under the banner of freedom, citizenship, and autonomy, it lost its noble functions and credibility under the Macedonian heirs to Alexander's fortunes, who used it as a means of colonization and imperial control. The Hellenistic city brought to the Levant Greek learning, but it did not offer franchise to the native populations, so it could not serve as a substitute for what had been destroyed. Thus, the traditional hierarchies of royal power, priestly purity, and official scribal activity were gone. These were the institutions that had held together the ancient temple states, the official structures that merged to create a single social and cultural organism. And as for the Romans, their contribution to the well being of peoples in the Levant was a soulless superimposition of law and order, a network of military surveillance and economic exploitation that was incapable of commanding the loyalty of the peoples they governed. Thus, we are coming to understand that the Greco Roman age was experienced as an erosion of illustrious traditions and as a fragmentation of societies whose loss was keenly felt by all the peoples of the eastern Mediterranean lands. Foreign governance within a people's home country and the widespread displacement of people from their native lands left many traditional social and religious functions unattended. People were left to their own devices, whether at home in an alien environment or living abroad in ghetto like clusters throughout the empires. An explosion of human energy was unleashed in the quest to salvage what one could of one's illustrious traditions, and an amazing outpouring of human ingenuity was invested in the quest to fill the voids created by the disintegration of the older social systems. As people moved, some cultural artifacts were portable, such as the memories, lore, myths, and literature that people cherished. These they took with them wherever they went. Other monuments to a culture could be recreated, such as shrines that transplanted in miniature a place to say one's prayers and make one's offerings to familiar heroes and gods. A shrine could be as simple as the creation of a statue at home or a stela, a stone inscribed with the virtues of a god in some public place. A shrine could be as ornate as a temple, complete with imported priests, oracles, festivals, and processions. Private resident donors, city councils, and ethnic associations were often involved in the process of recognizing a foreign god and accommodating its cult. The so called mystery religions of Isis, Osiris, Attis, Adonis, Mithra, and the Syrian goddess are examples of diaspora cults which claim to represent archaic religions and cultures rooted in other lands. But portable artifacts and diaspora cults could not reconstitute the fully orbed societies in which a people's cultural tradition had been inculcated. Living in an expansive, multicultural world meant rubbing shoulders with others, putting pieces of one's own culture on display, and experiencing and experimenting with new ways to negotiate one's place in the larger scheme of things. Three manifestations of human creativity characteristic for the Greco Roman age will help paint the culture setting within which the attraction of the Jesus movement can be understood. One important phenomenon of the Greco Roman age was the appearance of the religious and philosophical entrepreneur, sometimes called the divine man, sometimes the sophist or sage. The entrepreneur stepped into the void left vacant by the demise of traditional priestly functions at the ancient temple sites and addressed the confusion, concern, and curiosity of people confronted with a complex world that was felt to be at the mercy of the fates. Artemidorus, oh, oh boy, I can't say this one. It's spelled Oneirocriticion, a handbook for dream interpretation, documents a profession that worked for a fee. Interpreters of dreams accumulated a large archive of lore about dreams, principles of interpretation, and useful examples of typical dreams. Interpretation focused on concerns common to people living in uncertain times: success and failure, whether a human relationship would bring well being, and what to do in the event of loss, ill health, or untoward circumstances. Other entrepreneurs set up oracles. An example is the famous snake oracle of Alexander Abonoticus. whew, whom Lucian portrayed as a fraud. A huge collection of magical potpourri attests the profession of those who knew how to concoct. Wow, I'm having trouble reading. A huge collection of magical potpourri attests the profession of those who knew how to concoct potions and for a formulae for every eventuality. Professional physicians and charismatic healers complemented the official shrines known for their healing miracles, such as those of the god Asclepius and Epidaurus, Cos, and elsewhere. Astrologers also were regarded as professionals, as were diviners who could read the flutters of birds or the entrails of a sacrificed animal and so predict the future. And then there were the itinerant teachers who stepped forth to sell their philosophies and advice to anyone in search of guidance, called sophists by those who sought to discount their teachings, and divine men by those who idealized them. The figure of the lone sage exemplified the individual's quest for wholeness and self-sufficiency in the midst of a world devoid of social services and supports. A second characteristic of the Greco-Roman age was the formation of small social units, variously called fellowships. Another word offered here was spelled Koinoniai. Koinoni, I assume. Festive companies, diasoi, or collegia. These were created by people seeking support in pursuit of common interests, ranging from ethnic comradeship and cultural conservatism. Cultural conservation through funeral societies, religious conventicles, and monastic communities, to include a variety of craft guilds organized for economic protection in the wild and woolly world of international trade. Because fellowships tended to be ethnically based and thus seem to have been an apparently natural development, and because we are so accustomed to organizations such as clubs, lodges, and ethnic community centers in our own society, it may be difficult for us to grasp the significance of this novel development in social formation. It deserves recognition as a very important development in the social history of Western culture. Fellowships substituted for societies that had been destroyed. Their novelty resided in a combination of the free association of individuals with membership controlled by elections, fees, and rules. To belong to such an association was therefore quite a different matter than belonging to a family, tribe, temple state, or nation. Experimentation in the organization and function of such a fellowship was called for by the wide range of purposes to which this simple model was put. The model determined only that members meet regularly. The average was approximately a month, usually for a common meal, after which business and socializing became the order of the day. A third characteristic of the Greco-Roman age was a burgeoning preoccupation with ideas, philosophies, and the writing of literature. This phenomenon may also be understood as a quest to understand a world grown problematic because of social uncertainties. Boy, some of this stuff's starting to sound familiar. Much of this intellectual activity was expressly devoted to an exploration of social issues. National epics and local histories had to be revised and romanticized in order to compete with the illustrious histories of other peoples. A new ending had to be found for epics that had celebrated the ancient temple sites. Archaic epics were embellished as models of ideal societies in order to gain critical leverage for assessing contemporary regimes and social arrangements. The laws of Solon and Moses, the royal bearing of Hercules, David, and Osiris, and the human representation of Gilgamesh, Adam, Prometheus, and the seven sages were all researched for guidance applicable to the present state of affairs. Treatises flourished, treatises flourished on the topics of kingship and tyranny, the ideal ruler, and the basis for laws and humanistic ethics. In general, questions related to authority and power, virtue and justice, law and well-being were burning issues that controlled much of the philosophical discourse and literature of the time. What if we let Galilee have its place in the Greco-Roman world? What if the people of Galilee were not isolated from the cultural mix that stimulated thought and produced social experimentation in response to the times? What if Galileans were fully aware of the cultural and intellectual forces surging through the Levant? What if we acknowledged that the compact and convoluted history of foreign conquests in Galilee had created disaffection for many Galileans and a predisposition for social and cultural critique? What if the mix of indigenous, Hellenistic, Jewish, and Roman cultures had disturbed the social equilibrium enough to challenge the traditional diffidence of the people in Galilee? What if we thought the Galileans were capable of entertaining novel notions of social identity? What then? Why then we would be ready for the story of the people of Q. So ends part 4. Part 1.4, Galilee Before the War, from the book The Lost Temple, the Book of Q and Christian Origins. The next reading will start part 2, the text of the Lost Gospel. Thank you so much for listening. And again, I do apologize for any and all mispronunciations. Reading this has become a tongue twister for me, and I know I will improve over time. With that, you have a good day. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.